The scream wasn't mine, but it came from my throat. I turned, shaking, to see a figure. Standing in the moonlight, its skin dripping like wax, eyes gleaming black as it mimicked my every move. My legs refused to run as it took a staggering step closer, its melted smile stretching unnaturally wide. I was halfway down the trail when I heard it. A scream, sharp and raw, ripped through the trees. It froze me where I stood. It wasn't just loud. It was me, my voice. I turned slowly, dread crawling up my spine. The woods were silent again, too silent. No rustling, no leaves, no bird song, just the lingering echo of my scream fading into the trees. That's when I saw it. Something stood in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the fading sunlight. It was a person, but the shape was wrong. Its skin glistened like molten wax, dripping in slow, sticky globs. Its face, God, its face. It was like someone had tried to sculpt a human from clay and let it melt in the sun. It didn't move at first, just tilted its head in a way that felt mocking, as if it could see the terror coursing through me. Then it jerked forward, not walking but twitching, like a puppet on strings. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. My legs screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. Its mouth stretched open, too wide, the edges tearing, and I heard it again. That scream. My scream. I ran. The woods blurred around me as branches lashed at my arms, and the ground threatened to trip me with every step. My chest burned, my heart pounding like a drum. Behind me, the thing moved, its twitching, jerky steps crackling through the underbrush. I didn't stop until I reached my campsite. Relief was short-lived. Everything was wrong. My tent was shredded, its fabric hanging like strips of flesh. My gear was scattered, some of it clawed, open, some crushed beyond recognition. I grabbed my phone, fumbling with shaking hands, but the screen was shattered. It flickered. Once, and for a split second, I saw my reflection, only it wasn't mine. The face staring back was warped, melting, the eyes too dark and empty. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as I shoved what I could into my bag. That's when I saw it again, standing at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move this time, just stood there, tilting its head from side to side. Its mouth was twitching, almost like it was trying to smile. I couldn't stop shaking. My breathing came out in short, uneven gasps, and I swear I could hear it mimicking the sound. Every second. I couldn't stay. I couldn't think. I just ran, clutching my bag, desperate to get away. The trail I knew so well felt unfamiliar now, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. And no matter how far I ran, the feeling of being watched never left me. I don't know how long I've been running. The trail was supposed to lead me out, but the woods, they seemed endless. The trees leaned closer together, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. That's when I saw them, the carvings. At first I thought they were initials or markings left by other hikers, but as I got closer, I realized they were faces. Crude, uneven faces, with hollow eyes and streams carved down their cheeks, like tears. A cold wind blew through the trees, carrying with it a sound that froze me in place. Laughter. My laughter. But it was wrong, broken and distorted, like a recording played backward. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker until it sputtered out completely. Darkness swallowed me, thick and impenetrable. In the pitch black, I could hear it, my voice, whispering, just behind me. When the light finally came back, the carvings seemed closer, their hollow eyes staring directly at me. I stumbled into a clearing and found the cabin. Relief flooded me. A place to hide, maybe. Someone to help. The door creaked open under my weight, and the inside was colder than the night air. The walls were lined with photos, hundreds of them. I moved closer, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The people in the photos were smiling, but their faces were wrong, warped, melting, the eyes too empty. My stomach turned when I saw my own photo pinned to the wall, fresh ink dripping from it. My face was melting too. I clutched the diary tightly as I slipped out the cabin's back door, the air biting with unnatural cold. The woods were even darker now, and my flashlight had grown dim, barely illuminating the twisted roots beneath my feet. The forest felt alive, its oppressive silence broken only by my ragged breaths and the occasional snap of a distant branch. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it watching me. Every hair on my neck stood on end, and the heaviness in my chest tightened with every step. Learns from you. It feeds on you. I shook the words from my mind and kept moving. Time blurred. The trail should have been straightforward, but the trees seemed to close in, their shapes distorting. I began to hear whispers, not from behind me, but all around. My own voice echoed faintly through the forest, repeating things I hadn't said aloud. Then I saw the clearing. Relief flooded me until I realized what was in it. A massive, ancient tree loomed at the center, its bark blackened like charred flesh. Its skeletal branches twisted toward the sky, and hanging from them were personal items. Boots, backpacks, hats, even broken phones. My stomach dropped when I saw my own shredded backpack swing gently on a low branch. I hadn't left it there. My legs nearly gave out, but I forced myself forward. My breath caught in my throat. The creature emerged from the shadows. This time, it was closer. Its melted face rippled, unnaturally, and its body bubbled like boiling tar. It stood inhumanly still, staring at me. Then it tilted its head, and I realized with gut-wrenching horror that it wasn't just staring anymore. Its face had begun to look like mine. I don't know why I stopped running. My entire body screamed at me to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead, I turned to face it. "You're not real!" I shouted, my voice cracking. My words echoed through the clearing, but something about the echo was wrong. It wasn't fading, it was repeating, looping back at me in fragments. The creature tilted its head, its expression an exaggerated mockery of my own fear. Then it laughed, a deep, wet sound that made my skin crawl. The diary's warnings burned in my memory. Don't let it take you. Fight back. My hands trembled as I grabbed a sharp rock from the ground. Desperation overtook fear, and I carved one of the weeping faces from the trees into my forearm. Pain exploded, but it anchored me to reality. The creature flinched, its body glitching like static on a broken screen. Its melted grin faltered for the first time, but only briefly. It lunged forward, its bubbling form stretching unnaturally toward me. I fumbled in my pocket and found a pack of matches. With shaking hands, I struck one and lit a patch of dry grass. The creature screamed, not in its own voice, but in mine. Its body writhed, flickering between its original melted form and a distorted version of me. The blackened tree began to react. Its branches twisted violently, and the objects hanging from them swung wildly, as if the tree itself were alive. I hurled the last of my matches at its base, and fire roared to life. As the tree collapsed into a fiery heap, the creature let out a final ear-splitting shriek. Its form twisted and burned, fading into the smoke. But even as the fire consumed it, I saw its melted grin. It looked satisfied. When I woke, I was lying on the edge of the woods, the sky an unnatural shade of gray. My body ached, my arms and legs stiff, but the weight pressing down on my chest wasn't just exhaustion, it was dread. The tree was gone, reduced to a heap of smoldering ashes. The creature was nowhere in sight. I pushed myself up, groaning as pain shot through my arm. That's when I saw it, the scar, jagged and raw, carving the outline of the weeping face into my skin, the same face that had been on the trees. I rubbed it, hoping it was just a smear of ash, but it didn't fade. It was a part of me now. The walk to the road was a blur. I flagged down a passing car, the driver's wide-eyed stare lingering on my torn clothes and wild expression. They didn't believe my story. No one would. They told me I must have been dehydrated, lost, or worse. But part of me wanted to believe them. I clung to that possibility like a lifeline. For a few days, things seemed normal, or as normal as they could be. But then the little things started. My reflection in the mirror lingered a second too long when I turned away. Its movements slightly out of sync. My voice sounded off when I spoke, like there was a faint echo, layered underneath. And then last night, I heard it again. My scream. It started faint, muffled by the walls of my apartment, but grew louder, sharper. I turned toward the mirror and there it was, its melted grin stretched impossibly wide, its dark eyes gleaming with something like recognition. It tilted its head, mimicking my movement. Perfectly, but then it did something I couldn't. It stepped forward. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as I watched its waxy fingers press against the inside of the glass. As I write this, I can feel it watching me. The reflection isn't mine anymore. It's its. I don't know how much time I have left, but I need you to listen. If you're reading this, check your reflection. Look closely. Make sure it's really you. But be careful. If it moves when you don't, it's already too late. Do you dare to share this story? Each retelling makes it stronger, each word another step closer. Are you sure you're alone right now? Or is something watching from the shadows? The knock came just after midnight, sharp and insistent. I wasn't expecting anyone, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the sound of fingers. Too many fingers. Scraping the wood as they dragged down my door, leaving deep grooves. When I called out, the voice that answered sounded like mine. I didn't sleep that night. Even after the voice stopped, I stayed curled in the corner of my living room, clutching a kitchen knife like it would actually protect me. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the groan of the pipes, made my skin crawl. My mind wouldn't stop replaying. I'd heard my own voice whispering on the other side of the door, "Let me in." When morning finally came, I forced myself to check the door. My heart pounded as I unbolted it, bracing for something, anything, on the other side. The hallway was empty, but the door itself was ruined. Long, jagged grooves ran down the wood, deep enough to expose splinters beneath the paint. Each mark was deliberate. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was just some weird prank. Maybe kids in the building, maybe someone's dog. But then I thought of the voice, my voice, and the laughter. Haze died in my throat. "Are you okay, dear?" I jumped, spinning around to see Mrs. Flores, my neighbor. She was standing in her doorway, holding a potted plant and staring at the scratches. Her face was pale, her usual warm smile, replaced with something that looked like worry or fear. I don't know," I stammered. "Did you hear anything last night?" She nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Be careful," she said, her voice low. "Once it starts, it doesn't stop." Before I could ask her what she meant, she shuffled back into her apartment and closed the door. That night, I felt it again. The sense of being watched. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, just out of reach. I told myself it was exhaustion, but deep down, I knew better. Flickered, and the faint sound of scraping began again. It was soft at first, like something testing the walls. Then it grew louder, more deliberate. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't coming from the door this time. It was coming from inside. Grabbing my phone, I opened the camera and pointed it at the hallway, praying I wouldn't see anything, and stomach dropped. A figure stood in the frame, its arms impossibly long, its fingers stretching and twitching. There were so many of them, more than should have been possible, each one ending in a sharp, curved tip. I froze, unable to look away as it turned slowly toward the camera. Its face was a blur of shadows, but I could feel it looking at me. The screen flickered, and the figure was gone. But the scraping? It was closer now, louder. I locked every door, shoved a chair under the knob, and curled up on the bed, shaking. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But as I lay there, the scraping stopped. Silence. Then came the knock. 1, 2, 3. Sharp raps against my bedroom closet door. I couldn't move. My eyes stayed locked on the closet door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The knocks had been deliberate, each one measured and precise, like whoever, or Whatever was on the other side knew I was listening. "Please," a voice whispered. "Please let me in." Tears stung my eyes. It wasn't her. It couldn't be her. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks. She was years away. I stumbled backward, clutching my phone like it would save me. The closet door didn't move, but the air felt heavier, thicker. The voice came again, softer this time. "It's okay. I'm here now. Let me in." I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I dialed the building's maintenance office, barely able to form words. Someone's in my apartment." I managed to choke out. The man on the other end sounded tired, annoyed. "We'll send someone in the morning," he said. "No," I snapped, my voice rising. "You don't understand. There's something—" "Another one?" he muttered, almost to himself. My heart stopped. "What do you mean, another one?" He hesitated, then hung up. Desperate for answers, I started searching online. It didn't take long to find forums and urban legends about things that mimic voices, creatures that use familiarity to lure people in. The stories were fragmented, but they all had one thing in common. Once you hear it, it doesn't stop. The name Daniel Ross kept popping up in threads. A former tenant in my building. Someone who had left suddenly and without explanation. I found his social media and sent him a message explaining everything. His response was instant. I stared at the screen, my fingers trembling. "What is it? How do I stop it?" I typed back. The message disappeared. Then my phone glitched, the screen flashing a distorted version of my hallway, head tilted toward the camera. That night, the knocking returned. Not just at my front door this time, it was everywhere. The walls, the windows, the closet. They sounded like me. I couldn't stop trembling as I set up my phone in the hallway, angling it toward the front door. Hands fumbled with the tripod, the plastic joints creaking as I adjusted the height. The scratches on the door were still there, deeper and more jagged than before. A sinister reminder that whatever was out there wasn't going to stop. I told myself this was for proof. If I captured something, anything, on video, maybe someone would believe me. Maybe I'd believe myself. By midnight, the apartment was cloaked in silence, the kind that presses against your ears and makes your own breathing sound too loud. I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, phone in. The squad was still, until a detective spoke, and watching the live feed from the hallway camera. And then it started. The first knock was faint, almost polite, as if whatever was out there wanted me to think it had manners. Move, but the sound came again, sharper this time. "Let me in," it whispered. My blood turned to ice. The voice was mine, down to the faint quaver I couldn't hide when I was scared. Hearing it, spoken back to me, distorted and wrong, made my stomach churn. Static washing over the screen for a moment before resolving again. And then I saw it. The figure stood at the door, its outline distorted like a shadow projected through rippling water. My breath hitched as I leaned closer to the screen. Its arms were too long, stretching down to the floor, testing the air. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was glued shut. The figure tilted its head toward the camera, as though it knew I was watching. The static returned, the feed cutting in and out. Each time it came back, the figure was closer, closer, closer. The last frame froze, the screen capturing its face, or what I thought was a face. The grin stretched wide, splitting its lower jaw like a grotesque puppet. Its teeth were sharp and uneven, packed into its mouth like shards of broken glass. And the eyes, they weren't eyes at all, just black pits that seemed to pulse with something alive. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted for the door, yanking it open with shaking hands. The hallway was empty. For a moment I stood there, gasping for breath as my eyes darted from one shadowed corner to the next. The air was thick with the stench of decay, so foul it burned my nostrils. I gagged, stumbling back into the apartment and slamming the door shut. The scratches were deeper now, the wood splintering in some places. My phone buzzed violently in my hand, and I nearly dropped it. When I glanced at the screen, the feed was gone, replaced by a single message in bold, jagged text. "It's already inside." I threw the phone across the room. It shattered against the wall, and for a moment, I thought the silence would swallow me whole. Inside of my bedroom closet, I backed away, my mind racing. I needed answers. Something, someone, anything to help me. My feet carried me to Mrs. Flores's door before I even realized I'd left my apartment. I banged on her door, louder than I ever would have dared under normal circumstances. The door creaked open a crack, and her pale, wrinkled face appeared in the gap. "Mrs. Flores," I gasped, my words tumbling over each other. It's back. It's at my door. Or, no, my closet. I saw it on my camera. She held up a trembling hand to stop me, her eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. She stepped back, letting me inside, and shut the door behind us with a soft click. "You saw it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, swallowing hard. "What is it? What does it want?" She hesitated, her hands wringing the hem of her cardigan. "It took my husband," she said. Finally, her voice cracking. "Years ago, he answered the door." "What happens if I don't?" I asked, my voice shaking. Her eyes filled with tears as she shook her head. "It doesn't stop. Not until you open the door. We'll find another way. It always does." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stumbled back, shaking my head. "No, there has to be a way to stop it." She didn't answer. She just stared at me with a look of pity that made my skin crawl. I ran back to my apartment, slamming the door behind me. My chest heaved as I leaned against the wood, my ears straining for any sound. The knocking had stopped, but the closet door was open, just a crack, and I swear, in the darkness beyond, I saw something move. The door creaked open, each movement a drawn-out wail that cut through the suffocating silence. Whatever was waiting for me. The closet revealed nothing but pitch-black darkness, yet the breathing persisted, wet, raspy, and close. It seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the very air around me. The stench of rot, thickened, sharp, and invasive, curling in the back of my throat. "You opened it." The whisper cut through me like a razor. It was my voice, twisted and layered with something guttural, something ancient. The knife slipped from my trembling hand, clattering to the floor. My legs locked in place as the air behind me turned frigid. I knew what was there before I turned. I felt it, towering and cold, its presence warping the room around it. The figure wasn't distorted anymore. It had taken shape, a nightmare pulled into reality. Its body was grotesquely elongated, its limbs tapering into spindly fingers. Too many fingers. They writhed and clicked against each other, moving independently like the legs of a spider. Each nail glistened, wet and sharp, but it was its face that undid me. It was my face, or what could have been mine, in a shattered mirror. The grin stretched unnaturally wide, the corners splitting to reveal rows of jagged teeth, packed together like shards of broken glass. Its hollow eyes weren't empty anymore. They turned with movement, a storm of tiny shadows that seemed alive. I stumbled backward, tripping over the bed frame. The creature cocked its head, mocking the way I had fallen. Its grin stretched wider, splitting its cheeks further as black ichor dripped down its neck. It stepped closer, its fingers dragging along the floor, leaving scorched, smoking trails. "You shouldn't have opened it," it said, the malice in its voice making my skin crawl. I scrambled backward, my breathing ragged. "What do you want from me?" I managed to choke. "Oh." It paused, as if considering. Then it crouched low, its face inches from mine. "Everything," it whispered. Before I could scream, the first finger touched me. It was impossibly cold, like death itself, and the second it brushed my skin, the strength drained from my body. My limbs grew heavy, unresponsive, as if I were sinking into quicksand. The shadows in the room began to move, converging on me, swallowing the light. My vision blurred, but I could still see its face, leering as its fingers wrapped around my arms, my legs, pulling me deeper into the darkness. And then, something changed. The shadows around me shifted, and suddenly, I wasn't in my room anymore. The walls were gone, replaced by something vast and endless. Shapes moved in the distance, other figures, long-limbed and wrong, their forms twisting unnaturally as they crept closer. The creature released me, its grin fading as it stepped back. I tried to stand, but the ground beneath me wasn't solid. It rippled like liquid, dragging me down. "You're part of it now," the creature said. Its voice no longer just mine. It was dozens of voices, layered together in a chorus of suffering. Say Ula. The figures in the distance grew clearer, and my heart stopped. They weren't strangers. I recognized them. The faces of people I'd seen in passing. Neighbors, strangers on the street. Each one bore the same stretched, mutilated grin. Their eyes swirled with the same storm of shadows. As they closed in, I realized the truth. They had all opened the door. I wake up in the same room every day, but it's not my room. The walls are alive, pulsing faintly. Their surface slick with something wet. The shadows shift constantly, forming shapes that vanish when I try to focus on them. The figure is gone, but I feel it watching, always watching. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear the knock. 1, 2, 3. I've tried to escape, but there's no way out. The door is always locked, and even if I force it open, it only leads back here. The same room, the same pulsing walls. And now, I'm not alone. I hear whispers in the shadows, voices overlapping in strange, broken patterns. They call my name. They laugh, and sometimes they scream. But the worst part? I can feel myself changing. My reflection in the warped, blackened window isn't mine anymore. My face stretches wider each day, my smile splitting at the corners. My eyes, they're starting to swirl. I don't know how much longer I have before I become one of them. If you hear the knock, don't answer. Don't open the door. Don't let it in. But if you already have, then it's too late. Do you hear that sound behind you? Are you sure you're alone right now? Or is it already inside? I heard the crunch, a brittle, sharp sound like glass grinding underfoot. It came from the corner of my room, where the shadows twisted into something too tall, too thin, unfolded, scraping the walls with jagged edges. And as it stepped forward, the sound grew, louder. My stomach turned as I realized it wasn't the floor breaking, it was its skin. I woke up gripping my phone like a lifeline, the faint blue glow of the screen casting shadows across the room. My curtains were drawn tight, but the scratches on the wall caught. In fact, the light, jagged and fresh. I tried to convince myself I'd dreamed it all, but the shards on the floor, glittering, unnaturally sharp, told a different story. I grabbed a pair of gloves and a dustpan, trying to sweep them up. The shards resisted, digging into the plastic like they didn't want to be moved. One piece caught the edge of my glove, slicing clean through the thick fabric and grazing my skin. Blood welled up, bright and red, and for a moment, I swore the shard pulsed faintly in response, like it was alive. My hands shook as I finished cleaning. I called Daniel, desperate for someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. He answered on the third ring, his voice groggy but familiar. "Evelyn, it's probably nothing," he said after I told him. "Weird dreams happen. The scratches? Maybe your balls are just old." "Then come see them," I shot back, trying to keep my voice steady. Daniel arrived later that morning, carrying coffee and his usual sarcastic charm, but when he saw the scratches, his smile faltered. He ran his fingers over the grooves, tracing their uneven steps. "Okay. Yeah, that's weird," he admitted, his voice low. "Maybe you should get someone to check the place out." His unease made my stomach churn. Daniel was the grounded one, the rational one. If he was spooked, I was in trouble. That night, I forced myself to bed early, hoping to drown my anxiety in sleep. It didn't work. I woke again, my heart pounding, to the sound of faint crunching. This time, it wasn't inside the room. I crept to the window, my legs trembling as I peeked through the curtains. My breath caught in my throat. The creature was perched on the street lamp outside. Its wings glimmered in the yellow glow, fractured patterns of light dancing across the pavement like shards of broken mirrors. It was taller than I remembered, its limbs unnaturally thin, its head cocked at an angle that could have been possible. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, locking onto me the second I moved. I slammed the curtains shut and backed away, my chest tight with fear. I didn't sleep again that night. The sound followed me everywhere. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The faint crunching echoed in the quiet moments at Bosse, home, a sound I could almost dismiss as lingering fear. But then I started hearing it in places I shouldn't have. At work, it came from the bathroom, soft and deliberate, like someone pacing outside the stall. Held my breath, heart racing, but when I opened the door, the hall was empty. In my car, I swore it came from the back seat. I glanced in the rearview mirror so often, I almost were ending another car. Even in the middle of the day, under the sun, the sound stayed with me, faint, persistent, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I couldn't take it anymore. I spent hours online, scrolling through forums and local legend blogs, searching for anything that might explain what I was experiencing. That's when I found it. A story, buried deep in the comment section of an obscure blog. The writer described a creature with wings of glass, one that reflected the fears of its chosen victim, and grew stronger the more isolated they became. Once you've seen it, the post read, it doesn't stop until it's all you see. I tried to brush it off as nonsense, but the more I read, the more the details lined up. The scratching, the glittering shards, the presence that followed. I told Daniel about the story. It's an urban legend, he said, though his voice wasn't as steady. As usual, you're just scaring yourself, it's nothing. But then he called me a week later, his voice shaking. I think I saw it, he whispered. It was outside my window. Evelyn, what the hell is going on? Daniel arrived the next morning, carrying coffee and his usual crooked smile. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of relief. He was real, solid, and normal in a way my life hadn't been for what felt like forever. The apartment, on the other hand, wasn't. Scratched walls, glass shards piled in, corners, and curtains drawn tight against the sunlight. It felt more like a lair than a home. All right, he said, plopping down on the couch like this was any other visit. Let's deal with your, glittery demon raccoon or whatever's giving you nightmares. I tried to laugh, but it came out shaky. It's not a raccoon, Daniel. Raccoons don't leave claw marks or glowing wings. Okay, he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. But as his fingers traced one of the deep gouges in the wall, his smile faltered. These look serious. Did you try to fight it off, or something? I shook my head. It just does that, like it's testing the room. Or maybe me. That night, the air in the apartment grew heavier, like the walls were closing in on us. Daniel stayed, insisting we camp out in the living room with all the lights on. For the first hour, the silence almost felt normal. But then, the sound started again. It was faint at first, like someone stepping on brittle twigs, and then sharper, more deliberate. Crunching, snapping, like glass grinding against itself. Daniel sat up, his body tense. You hear that? I nodded, my throat dry. The sound grew louder, closer, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift. They didn't move naturally. They stretched, twisted, forming jagged edges that seemed to ripple with intent. Daniel grabbed my arm, his grip tight. What the hell is that? It's here, I whispered. Okay, we're doing something. His voice wavered, but he stood up, scanning the room. If it's made of glass, maybe it can't handle its reflection. We need mirrors. We scrambled to find every reflective surface we could. Mirrors, picture frames, even the polished tray from the coffee table. We angled them toward the dark corners, hoping to trap whatever was lurking. For a while, it seemed to work. The crunching stopped, the shadows still. But the silence didn't last. A loud crack shattered the stillness. My heart jumped as one of the mirrors fractured, a jagged spiderweb spreading across its surface. Then another cracked, and another. The largest mirror rippled like water, and the creature emerged. It unfolded itself with deliberate slowness, its glass wings shimmering as they stretched to full span. The edges of its wings, I scraped the furniture, leaving deep gouges in the wood. Its body was a mosaic of cracked reflections, constantly shifting. Its face, if you could call it, that was a warped version of mine, grinning too wide, its hollow eyes fixed on me. "Stay behind me," Daniel shouted, pulling me toward the hallway. But the creature moved faster. It lunged, and its wings cut through the air with a high-pitched. I screamed as one of the shards embedded itself in my shoulder, sending searing pain radiating through my body. Daniel yanked me back, his voice frantic. "Go, Evelyn, go! Don't stay!" I shouted. But as we tried to retreat, the creature multiplied. Each shattered mirror birthed smaller versions of itself, their jagged forms skittering toward us. Daniel swung a chair at one of them, and it screeched, but the blow barely slowed it down. I turned to him, tears blurring my vision. "We have to destroy the mirrors." He nodded, his eyes wide with panic, and together we began smashing every reflective surface in the room. Each shatter sent a deafening shockwave through the air, the creatures glitching and flickering like broken projections. But then the largest mirror fractured further, revealing something that made my blood run cold. Daniel's reflection stepped forward. It wasn't him, not really. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, but the face was identical. It grinned at me, its teeth too sharp, its eyes filled with swirling shadows. "What the?" Daniel started, but before he could finish, the reflection lunged at him, pulling him toward the mirror. Unrecognizable. "Daniel!" I screamed, rushing toward the mirror, but I couldn't reach him. The last thing I saw was his face disappearing into the shards, replaced by my own reflection, grinning back at me. I turned to face the creatures, or what was left of them. They were smaller now, weaker, but they were still moving, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The sound of crunching glass filled the air, growing louder, more deafening. I didn't think. I grabbed a heavy lamp and swung it at the nearest mirror, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. One by one, I destroyed every remaining surface, my screams blending with theirs until the room was silent again. I fell to my knees, clutching my bleeding shoulder, my breath ragged. The apartment was a wreck. Broken glass littered the floor, furniture lay in splinters, and the walls were gouged with deep, jagged marks. "Daniel," I whispered, staring at the fractured mirror where he had disappeared. The shards shimmered faintly, but his reflection was gone. I was alone, or so I thought. Behind me, the faint sound of crunching glass started again. My blood ran cold as I turned toward the shadows. They were moving, coiling like smoke, and then I saw it, my own face, brimming from the darkness. "You can't break what's already inside you," it whispered. The air felt heavy, vibrating with a low hum as the shattered fragments of glass littered the floor. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, my arms trembling from the effort of destroying every reflective surface in the apartment. The creature's screeches had finally silenced, its jagged form reduced to a pile of glittering shards. For a moment the room was still. The silence was so profound it felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. I collapsed against the wall, clutching my bleeding shoulder, staring at the fragments as they shimmered faintly in the dim light. It was over. It had to be. But then the smallest shard twitched. I froze, my chest tightening. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, and before I could react, another shard trembled, then another. Slowly, they began sliding toward one another, drawn together as if by an unseen force. "No," I whispered, scrambling to my feet. "No, no, no." I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a broken table leg, and slammed it into the pile. The shards scattered, their edges slicing into my skin, but they didn't stop moving. They slid back, toward the center, faster now, reforming piece by piece. The hum grew louder, the room vibrating with a sickening intensity. The shards began to rise, floating in the air, assembling themselves like pieces of a puzzle. The creature's wings took shape first, their edges sharper than before, glinting like 1,000 tiny blades. Its hollow eyes snapped open, locking onto mine. "You thought you could end me?" it whispered, its voice a chorus of overlapping tones. Mine, Daniel's, and countless others. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, splitting its face into jagged, mirrored fragments. I backed away, my legs trembling, but there was nowhere to go. The apartment seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls melting into shadow. The creature lunged, its wings slicing through. The air was a piercing hum. I raised the table leg to defend myself, but it passed through the creature as if it were smoke. Its jagged fingers wrapped around my wrist, cold and sharp, and the world spun. Suddenly, I was surrounded by mirrors. They stretched endlessly in every direction, reflecting infinite versions of myself. Each reflection was different, some smiling, some crying, some twisted into grotesque, unrecognizable forms. The creature loomed behind me in every reflection, its wings spreading wide, its grin fixed in triumph. "This is where I live," it whispered, leaning close. Its breath was cold against my ear. "And now, so do you." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the mirrors, echoing endlessly until it became something else. Laughter. My laughter. I woke up in my bed, the apartment eerily quiet. Sunlight streamed through the window, warm and bright, as if nothing had happened. For a fleeting moment, I thought it was all a nightmare. Then I saw the shard. It lay on the floor beside the couch, catching the light. It wasn't just a piece of glass. It pulsed. Faintly, warm to the touch, as if it were alive. I grabbed it, intending to throw it away, but the second my fingers closed around it, a vision exploded in my mind. "Mirrors. You can't break what's already inside you," it whispered. I dropped the shard and stumbled back, my chest heaving. The vision faded, but the words lingered, echoing in my mind. That night, I heard the crunching sound again. It came from the mirror in my bathroom. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't me. It didn't move when I did. Its grin widened slowly, unnaturally, until it stretched across its face, and then it whispered, "Let me in. Do you dare look into a mirror tonight? If you do, make sure it's really your reflection." Looking back, when was the last time you checked what's behind you in the mirror? Or what's hiding? Because surprise, inside your reflection.